Welcome to Monday morning and the first day of our week-long festival all around co-creation, and today is all around international practice. I'm not going to talk for long. My name's Sarah Blowers and I'm the director of the Co-Creation Change network here at Battersea Arts Centre, and it's really exciting and quite nerve-wracking to be here this morning after a lot of preparation. I'm not going to talk for long today, but I'm going to hand over to Fozia in a moment, who I've been working with for the last maybe 4 or 5 months on this festival. And I'd just like to say, firstly, you're in really safe hands. And I'd like to read Fozia's bio out, and we'll also put it in the chat because it's super. So I'm going to read this out. Fozia Ismail is a scholar, cook, and founder of Aruelo Eats, a platform for exploring politics, identity, and colonialism through East African food. She has designed and delivered workshops, presentations for organisations such as Keep It Complex, Company Drinks, Serpentine Gallery, Jerwood Project Space, Tate Modern, Museum of London, National Trust, Colonial Countryside Project, Media Bounty, Barings Bank, Oxford Cultural Collective, and was Bristol City Fellow for Arnold Feeney Contemporary Arts Centre in 2019 for her project Camel, Meat and Tapes. Her work has been published by Oxford Symposium on Food and Cookery, and she has designed lecture seminar series on food and empire for London School of Economics and for Black Book, a global representation platform for Black and non-white people working within hospitality and food media. She's been featured on the Observer Food magazine, BBC Two Nadia's Fast Flavours, BBC Radio 4 food programme, and many others. She's co-produced a podcast on cassette tapes with Caribou Projects and recently exhibited work at Bricks Relay Space on archives and cultural memory. When not critically eating her way through life's messiness, she can be found plotting with her sisters in arms, Ayan Silmi and fellow pervasive media resident Asma Jama, as part of the Dhaqan Collective, a Somali feminist art collective in Bristol. Thanks, Fozia. I actually feel quite hungry after reading all that. It's totally brilliant. I'm not going to talk too much. I'm going to hand over now and switch my screen off. Lovely to see so many people with us. Have a great session. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Thank you all for joining us. I think today is really exciting. We've got really a real range of speakers for you. I just want to put a context to one of the things that we were aiming for. So this was done, the International Festival, really, we wanted to kind of start the day by rooting it in some historical context. So we wanted to invite people to celebrate co-creative arts practice across the world, but also to engage with how we got here. So really getting into the nitty-gritty of empire building, colonialism, and that being the context for doing this work across the globe. And joining us for this, I'm so excited to have Dr. Sara Salem, from Assistant Professor LSE. She's a fantastic academic who works in political sociology, post-colonial studies, Marxist theory. She's the editor, edits journal Sociological Review and Historical Materialism. You can find her on Twitter at Sara Salem. We'll put that up on the chat as well. Her work explores connections between post-colonial theory and Marxism, with a special attention to the context of Egypt and the period of decolonization in the mid-20th century. She's particularly interested in questions of traveling theory, post-colonial, anti-colonialism, nationalism, and the afterlives and entanglements of European empire in the Middle East. Her first book, which was released last year, I believe, is called Anti-Colonial Afterlives in Egypt, The Politics of Hegemony, and it's published by Cambridge University Press. The book builds on its analysis of the afterlives of Egypt's moment of decolonization through an imagined conversations between Antonio Gramsci and Frantz Fanon around questions of anti-colonialism, resistance, revolution, and liberation. Liberation being one of the key themes, I feel, of today. So I'm so happy to have Sara join us. So one of the things we've been working on really is we're all here today and this week to look at the role of arts practice in making social change. So a question that I wanted to really explore with Sara is how do you think, Sara, that colonialism and empire kind of impacts on this work, and particularly our everyday lives?
Thanks, Fozia. It's so exciting to be here and to be working together again. And yeah, it looks like such an incredible program. So congratulations to everyone. I think that's such a great question. And I think obviously there's a way in which colonialism and the history of empire in particular have become kind of increasingly debated in Britain, which I think is really interesting to maybe think about why that's happening now. But I think that there's so many ways in which we're still all living with the afterlives of colonialism. I think when we think about the length of the European colonial project, which many people date to the 1400s, it was obviously a really expansive project. Most countries in the world were colonized by one European empire or another, but also it's a project that lasted 600 or 700 years. So to imagine that something of that temporal length or of that kind of scope geographically isn't still with us is really difficult, especially considering that when we think about the end of empire, for most places that was really only 50 or 60 years ago. So I think even from that perspective, there's obviously a case to be made that a project of that power and that time length would still be with us. But I also think there are ways in which we continue to see it in our everyday lives. And I think living in London, it's really clear. I mean, the city of London itself, if we think about many of the buildings, many of the huge institutions, including banks or government institutions, or even just buildings, a lot of this can be traced back as well, right, to the wealth that came from the colonies, that came particularly from the slave trade that Britain was heavily involved in. And so I think there's lots of ways, whether it's also linguistically, how most of the world, we're speaking in English, right, which is it's a global language for a reason, not necessarily because it's the best language or the easiest, but because, of course, it was spread through particular ways. So I think that there are all these ways in which obviously our world has been created through this project of empire. Alongside that, I also think when we think about educational or cultural institutions, there's ways in which certain narratives or ideas about the world, and especially about the global south or places outside of Europe and the US, continue to still have quite a lot of power. And I'm thinking here, of course, Edward Said's really classic text, Orientalism, where he argues that a big part of colonialism was that it was able to create stories about the rest of the world that we continue to reproduce, right? Whether it's conscious or unconscious. And I think some of these ideas obviously include that, there are parts of the world that are wealthy and parts that are poor, but this is an accident, or, it's to do with things that are internal to these places, whether it's the idea of some places being much more free or democratic than others. I mean, there's all these narratives or ideas that we often put out there or engage in. And I think that's also a really big thing for us to think about in these types of institutions. What are the stories that we're telling about other parts of the world? And what are these stories based on? Is it that we have these experiences or knowledge, or is it that these are narratives that are just so powerful that they remain unquestioned? And so, being from Egypt, and I remember when I moved to England, I was also really surprised to hear from so many people that they had never learned about colonialism at school, or even you can actually also get through university without necessarily learning about it. And to me, that was quite interesting because it's also something that's talked about quite a lot now in the media or in these debates around how colonialism has impacted the present. So I think one thing to think about is maybe, these stories that we tell and where we get this information from. Is it something that we've learned about or explored, or are these ideas that just continue to have a lot of power because they've been reproduced for hundreds of years now?
I love that. So that's I mean, I feel exactly that this context of how then people go and do work in arts practice and do this co-creative change, which is really based about kind of flattening out some of the hierarchies in power. That's so important, that context of colonialism and empire, that this isn't, this is the context, this is the global context that we're all finding ourselves in. And so when you're talking about that, I was thinking about, so what do you see as our kind of our responsibilities, given the current climate, the current political climate, and the kind of you mentioned the kind of lack of awareness or education in colonialism, and but yet here we're having these conversations in the media, but the conversations are happening in quite it's kind of ignorant, but also willful, as René Adolodge terms, willful ignorance of kind of white supremacy. And I'm really interested about what are the responsibilities of people who are working the arts. So we've got a range of people watching. We've got a range of people who will be engaging with this amazing week that's been put on. And so what would you say about people's responsibilities on understanding that the context that you've just described in their work?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think the first thing, which seems quite straightforward, but it seems to me is still something we need to work through, is also acknowledging that colonialism continues to have effects. I mean, I think often the debate seems to be, well, this was such a long time ago, or, we've moved on, or colonization in that form just doesn't exist anymore. But, so much work has shown that that's just not the case, right? There's so many ways in which these practices or logics continue. And I think just, the very recent illegal invasion of Iraq, for instance, shows us that those ideas or dynamics or military forms of power are still with us and continue to kind of threaten people in many parts of the world. So to me, the first step is really an acknowledgement that there is something called, some people have called this coloniality, that yes, formal colonization ended at some point, but there's ways in which coloniality itself continues. And how do we then challenge that? And what is our role in challenging the ideas that continue, or the economic or political inequalities that continue because of empire? I think another important dimension of this is to also situate ourselves and be conscious of the institutions that we work in. So, I mean, for example, here at the LSE, to think about how British universities were often part of the British colonial project. What has that created? But also to think of how disciplines like, anthropology, sociology, economics were very much tied into justifying empire. And so for academics, it's looked a lot like being conscious of that. And I imagine it would be very similar with a lot of cultural work as well. What are the institutions we're working within? Who is funding these projects? What are the responsibilities we have to maybe challenge these narratives or challenge these forms of inequality? And I think here, one thing I found incredibly important over time is thinking much more seriously about real collaborative work, and not necessarily just collaborative in that we have a partner in the global south, or a partner with, a marginalized community, but really thinking about resources. How do we redistribute those resources so people in other parts of the world have access to them, but also how are they part of the story making, and not just that we're using their lives or their stories so we can tell a story, but actually how can they be part of that initial part? Because I think that is often when the story gets set, right? And then we kind of bring in different people. But what stories would they tell instead of the stories we might think are important? So I think collaboration and a really critical and reflective form of collaboration is really important today, because the divisions, I think, between all of us are actually growing, even though we seem much more connected. And I think we have that responsibility to maybe reach out more, and also be willing to be uncomfortable. I think that that's just a reality. It's not going to feel great. I think we all kind of have been socialized to believe certain things that, at some point later we were like, this is not true, or this is not actually how this works. And it is it can be a very painful and uncomfortable experience, but that is also part of our responsibility to challenge that in ourselves and to see that this is also an important part of it, that it's individual, it's institutional, it's global, but what we can work on is that individual and institutional level, I think.
That's fantastic. I love everything that you've just, I feel like that particularly around the sharing of resources and story making, and how like these are the people, we're here in a position, we're working in the arts. It's a real key part of that kind of story making legacy. These are the resources that are handed out for certain practitioners to kind of go and make creative projects happen. And I think to have that context is so brilliant. We really appreciate that. We've got time for a few questions. We've got 10 minutes for any questions out there. So if anyone has any questions, I know I have a few more to follow up if the audience hasn't, but we're going to open up to questions. Okay, great. So one of the things I really liked that you mentioned was this role of collaboration and critical thinking. And it's something that I think as a Somali woman, I come across a lot with working with different institutions. And how do we, if we don't all are on the same page around this issue of colonialism, the impact that might have will be really difficult. We've got a question, sorry. I will open it up to the audience. I just wanted to think about that kind of interpersonal power dynamics that also impact on this work. So, sorry, this isn't a question, but I'd like to thank you both for framing this festival in this way. It's absolutely critical to remember this context when power dynamics are such a key aspect of arts production in general and co-creation in particular. That's from Ruth Gard. Thank you so much. That I'm just so happy that we had the opportunity to do this, and that we had the opportunity to bring Sara in, because her work around decolonial is just fantastic, decolonial thinking. And I feel that is something that, when you're talking about collaboration, Sara, these are the kind of things that I'm thinking about as well. How can academics collaborate more with arts practitioners? How can they collaborate with the culture sector so that it's kind of embedded in our practice rather than as seen as something separate? So I think that's really, really important. I don't know if we've got any more questions. Oh, someone's just told me we've gone over. We were scheduled to finish at 10:20. So thank you so much, Sara, for giving that context. I'm really blown away by everything. I've made notes so that I can reference back to what you were saying for this opening session, and I think it's the best way to start. So I hope you've all listened to some of those contextual issues that Sara's brought to the fore. Thanks so much for your time, Sara.
Thank you so much. Good luck with the festival.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.